where we've had a massive amount of expanding labor force. So basically, a lot of kids that became 20 or 25 that entered the labor force between 1985 and 2000, basically, we've had a massive increase. And now if I look at demographics going forward, it looks like that this is going to reverse pretty substantially over the next 20 to 25 years. That's the first thing I would like to get your thoughts on. And the second one is, once we maximize this model that you just described, then we have to move to another model where effectively we try and export growth from the outside, right? We, instead of let's say, as you said at the beginning, you try to get your share of income from outside effectively because your inside has been maximized already. How do you see those two things combined together? Your thoughts on demographics and basically on the new Chinese business model?
Well, the demographics are very important and over the long term in particular. And it's interesting the huge shift demographically that China has gone through. After 1949, after the revolution, we saw an explosion. China basically had a baby boom in the 1950s and 60s, and it had so many children that by the late 1970s, China had a kind of demographic problem in the sense that there were a huge number of dependents and not enough working age people. So basically, there were mostly because of kids. About, I think, 70 something percent of the population was non-working. It was a very, very high number. Um, no, let me see if I have that right. No, I'm sorry. I'm thinking later. The working share of the population was in the sort of low to mid 50s. I apologize. Uh, Now, in the US, it's in the low 60s. And I think in
Yes.
much of the rest of the world, it's in the low 60s. So China had a very a low share of working population in the low 50s. But the reason it had a low share was because there were so many kids. And I don't need to tell you, as the kids grow older, they all join the working population. At the same time, in 19, I think it was 78, they implemented, or 76, the one child policy. So the number of kids being added shrunk very rapidly. And the result was that China had an astonishing demographic boom. Its population grew, not very quickly, but it grew. But its working population soared by 1.5%, 2% a year, to the point where about 10 years ago, the working share of the population in China was around, it was in the low 70s, so very high,
Very
much
high.
higher than the rest of the world, from much lower than the rest of the world. But that peaked out a few years ago, and now we're reversing because all of those workers are retiring and they're not being replaced by children. So as a result, we are likely to see by the middle of the century, the working share will probably drop back down to the mid to high 50s, right? And again, you think of the US in the low 60s as sort of the standard. So China went from a much lower working share of the population to a much higher, which is fantastic for the economy. And now
Yes.
it's reversing that. So that's a problem. But what I always tell people is that that's a long term problem. And China really has a medium term problem that is much more serious. And that is consumption in China as a share of GDP is the lowest in the world. And it's the lowest in the world because the household income share of GDP is also the lowest in the world. So while the Chinese population is contracting, is that bad for demand or not? Well, if nothing changes, that's probably bad for demand. Although remember, a contracting population also means contracting production. Um, but what China really has to do is shift income from local governments, who retain about 20 to 25% of GDP, which is very high, to the household sector, which retains about 55% of GDP, which is very low. As you see that shift of income, then consumption per person will rise. And the ideal spot for China is that the consumption per person rises more quickly than the population declines. In that case, you will see growing consumption.